please welcome the Mayor of the City of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel.
Thank you. Please reserve that applause for when the Cubs secure tonight, okay? I don't want to get ahead of us. I was just telling the mayor this is an exciting time in the city, not just for what's being said in here, for a lot of what's going on outside the city. First of all, let me say to the Global Affairs, CCGA, and all that are here, first of all, it's an incredible new space, but also it's very exciting. As you know, last year we had the Global Conference for Cities, and it's a very exciting, I think, for the city of Chicago that as Mayor Khan made his first visit to the United States, he picked the city of Chicago to come to, the most American of American cities. This is a city that, and we were talking about what our aspirations are for our city. There's 100 cities in the world that, in my view, are the intellectual, cultural, and economic engines of the world economy. And our collective cities, both London and Chicago, share a lot in common with that, in the sense of the economy, the dynamism that happens culturally, intellectually, with our universities and our cultural scene, but also our economic scene. But with all that promise also comes the responsibilities to make sure that not only some neighborhoods succeed, but every neighborhood has a chance to succeed, and every resident of your city has a chance to participate in all that growth. And it's not an accident also, as we talk about it, and I assume a lot of people saw his op-ed today in the Chicago Tribune, and his comments about also integration and making sure everybody succeeds or has an opportunity to succeed, meaning the investments you make in education, the investments you make in transportation, the investments you make in housing, give every neighborhood and every resident of a city, London or Chicago, two cities that are in the top 10 cities globally, economically competitive cities, the opportunity to participate in that opportunity. And in the visit that he's having here, obviously we're going to see the Riverwalk, 1871, the Art Institute, but also Whole Foods in Englewood, and making sure that all parts of the city are part of his visit and all the opportunities that we want to see throughout the city happen. It's also, as I say this, is because we're two sons, both he and I, of immigrants, and the grandchildren of immigrants. And both London and Chicago stand tall today because our parents or our grandparents saw the opportunity when they made that travel and that journey to another city to give their children or their grandchildren a chance at a better tomorrow. And our responsibilities today as mayors of two global cities, two cities that are in the top 10 of globally competitive cities, are not only to see the chances of success in our economy, our culture, and our intellectual energy, but also the challenges that we face to make sure that all our residents have a chance to succeed, which means working harder at that global integration. And I close on this one comment. Last week I cut the ribbon at Jameson School on a new edition. Over 27 languages spoken at that school with over 30 to 40 different cultures. And it's number one elementary, one of the top 10 elementary schools in the city of Chicago. And those kids are learning from each other. While they have different heritages, different languages, their parents have the same aspiration for their future. And that, if we can do as a city and learn from each other and collaborate with each other, we have a brighter future together for all our residents. So I want to thank, again, the Global Conference for bringing everybody together, and most importantly, Mayor Khan for picking Chicago as his first visit in the United States. Thank you.
Mayor Emanuel, thank you so much, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's great to have all of you here. It's my pleasure to welcome Mayor Sadiq Khan to Chicago and to the Council on Global Affairs. Very grateful to Stephen Bridges and his team and the mayor and your team for helping to arrange this visit here. We're honored that Mayor Khan has chosen us as the first stop on his first official visit to the United States of America. Like Mayor Khan, the Council is at the beginning of a new journey. We're convening here in the Council's new conference center, which was officially opened just last week. and this will be just the 6th event that we're having here. We see this center as the central location for real, thought-provoking conversations, both in person and virtually, on the most pressing issues of our time. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided a platform for a variety of different voices to promote a deeper political understanding about our global role in the world. Today, the Western world, like global cities such as Chicago and London, are facing a choice, not simply between the traditional visions of left and right, or liberal and conservative, but between a world that is open or one that is closed. This is also the essence and the focus of Mayor Khan's discussions here tonight. Mayor Khan's historic election in May was a welcome affirmation that Londoners are interested in a world that is open, in facing the world instead of turning away from it, in embracing our differences rather than emphasizing them. In times of heated rhetoric, such as we have these days, the significance of this accomplishment by London and Londoners cannot be overstated. So today we look forward to hearing more about his unique perspective and the goals he has for London. In particular, we're interested in learning how to bridge the deep divides that still exist today, and the role that global cosmopolitan cities like London and Chicago can play in bridging these divides. As the host of the Chicago Forum on Global Cities, the challenges that global cities face is a topic near and dear to the Council. Now, before we begin our program, I would like to say a few more words about our guest tonight. Mayor Sadiq Khan has served as a Member of Parliament for 11 years before becoming the Mayor of London just this last May. He has held important ministerial posts, including as Minister for Community Cohesion and Minister of Transportation. Before entering politics, Mayor Khan was a human rights lawyer. Following his remarks, I will return to the stage and join Mayor Khan and take questions from you, our audience. Audience members and our viewers online, please note that tonight we will only be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link of which you can find on the screen in front of you. If you have an internet-enabled device, please type chi.cnf.io into your browser and select today's program, and you can then ask a question and vote on questions that have already been asked. We will try to cover as many of them as possible, but I hope you will understand if we cannot necessarily ask and answer every question. Let me also note that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent, nonpartisan organization, and that the views expressed on our platforms, whether here or including on our website, are the views of the people expressing them. They do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council on Global Affairs, its members, or its supporters. This time, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Council, Mayor Sadiq Khan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've been in a cupboard over there listening, and it's true, I have. Can I thank Eva for that kind introduction, and thank you, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for kindly hosting us today. I also want to thank Mayor Rahm Emanuel for being such a fantastic host to me and my team, and for making us feel so at home in your beautiful and buzzing city. Tonight we're going to visit the historic Green Mill Jazz Club together. And I've been reading the history books. The 1930s were pretty interesting. Rahm assures me it's much safer now than it was then. And in a couple of days, I have the honor of pitching the first ball at a Major League Baseball game. Now, I'm afraid it's not the Cubs, who I hear have been having a great season. Nor is it the White Sox, who I hear have been having not such a great season. It's the New York Mets. But don't... Rahm, don't hold that against me, man. And can I just scotch a rumor right now? As much as it would be great if it were true, because I know she's from Chicago, Chaka Khan is not my big sister. And for those journalists who wish it was true, I feel for you. So look, when you're the only person laughing at your jokes, it's not a great start. Look, one of the things that has struck me throughout my conversations with Rahm and my time in Chicago is how similar the challenges facing our great cities are. You know, nearly 4,000 miles separate London and Chicago. But the challenges we face over the coming years couldn't be more similar. Securing economic growth and development in a world that's more difficult than it used to be. Building the homes and infrastructure our cities need at a time of severe public sector financial restraint. Leading the front line in the battle against climate change and air pollution, dragging national governments behind us. Keeping our citizens safe, particularly with the growing threat of terrorism and extremism. And ensuring all of our communities are cohesive and integrated at a time of great social change and upheaval. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about this evening. In many ways, my election as mayor early this year was an embodiment of London's diversity, openness, and tolerance. I don't know if there are many Western cities that would elect a Muslim whose parents moved from Pakistan in the 1960s and who grew up on a housing project as their mayor. Or for that matter, many cities that would elect a Jewish mayor descended from Romanian immigrants whose mum was a trade union organizer and rock club owner. It's amazing to think how far London has come over recent decades in embracing diversity and tolerance. When my dad arrived in London, there were still signs in hotels, guest houses, and clubs that read, "No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs." And by blacks, they meant anyone who wasn't white. And now, in the city he chose to call home, his son has been elected as its mayor. My opponent in the London election this year ran one of the most divisive campaigns we have ever seen in British politics. It was a campaign purely designed to make Londoners question whether they really felt comfortable voting for someone of Islamic faith. And Londoners responded. Londoners responded with a resounding yes. And I'm humbled to say that I was elected with the biggest personal mandate in British political history. London is one of the most diverse and tolerant cities in the world. 1 of 3 Londoners were born outside the UK. Over 300 languages are spoken in our city. Every religion is freely practiced, and you can, of course, choose not to be a member of any organized religion. Rich and poor live side by side on the same streets and in the same communities. We thankfully escaped many of the most difficult problems around integration and community cohesion, problems that affect many great cities around the world. We don't have urban ghettos or areas of suburban neglect that have come to define many other European cities. Our city has remained relatively cohesive throughout the rapid growth over the past 30 years. Wave after wave of immigrant communities have been genuinely accepted into our city, from the Jewish community arriving at the beginning of the last century, to the post-war immigration from the Caribbean, from the Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian communities who arrived in the 1960s and the 1970s, to the Eastern Europeans during the last 2 decades, and North Africans in recent years. London really is a beacon of tolerance, cohesion, and integration around the world, and I'm immensely proud of that. But we need to be totally honest, because we're not perfect, and the equilibrium we have by and large struck remains fragile. My city faces many of the same challenges on social integration that Chicago, New York, Paris, Madrid, and Berlin face over the coming decades. Our urban populations are booming, and if we're honest, our levels of social integration are not keeping pace with our changing population and growing diversity. You know, just this year, London's population became the biggest it's ever been, passing the previous record set just before the Second World War. This rapid growth is a sign of our success. People are arriving because of the jobs, opportunities, and wealth our cities are creating. But it's also putting stress on our housing and infrastructure, and inevitably on our communities too. In the UK and across Europe, immigration is now at the highest rate ever. The number of immigrants arriving in Britain every year has doubled between 1997 and 2015. And these new communities coming to work and contribute to our economy have become increasingly concentrated and in some instances increasingly segregated, which means in the space of just a few years, some communities have been transformed beyond all recognition. Scientific and social advances mean that more of us are having children later in life and living into old age, which is changing the way in which different generations relate to one another. And it's putting a strain on our public services, whether schools or hospitals. And as across the entire Western world, the gap between the richest and poorest in our society has grown, with particular groups understandably feeling left behind, like white working class communities in some parts of London, and I know across the United States. These growing tensions make it harder for people from different backgrounds to walk a mile in one another's shoes. They make it harder for our communities to sustain the strong social ties and sense of trust we need to flourish in an interconnected world. And it can foster an environment of mistrust or even blame when demand for services or school places or homes outstrip supply. The less integrated our societies are, the greater the economic and social costs we face as a result. Failure to socially integrate impedes life chances and holds back economic growth by limiting opportunities and prolonging unemployment. One study I read suggested that Britain's social integration deficit costs us £6 billion each year. It also feeds extremism, whether in the Muslim community or the far right. By contrast, improving social integration leads to an improvement in social mobility and a more efficient economy. It can reduce anxiety and fear of crime, reduce fear of the other, and reduce mistrust between people. Now, these challenges are by no means insurmountable, but like most challenges, they do require careful management and planning. One of the lessons from around the world is that a laissez-faire or hands-off approach to social integration doesn't work. We need rules, institutions, and support to enable people to integrate into cohesive communities. And for the avoidance of doubt, I don't mean assimilation. I mean integration, and there's a difference. People shouldn't have to drop their cultures and traditions when they arrive in our cities and countries. I'm a proud Londoner, a Brit, European, someone of Pakistani heritage, of Asian origin, a Muslim. We all have multiple layers of identity. That's what makes us who we are. But I do believe in real social integration. And it's important to be clear about exactly what we mean by social integration, because it's one of those phrases that can mean different things to different people. To me, social integration means ensuring people of different ethnicities, faiths, cultures, age groups, sexual orientation, and incomes don't just tolerate each other, but live truly interconnected lives, meaningfully interacting with one another as neighbours, citizens, and friends, working together, playing together, studying together, interacting on a level playing field, and not being socially excluded because of their socioeconomic position. It means having a shared set of common values and laws that are clear, progressive, and tolerant, and around which communities can unite, a set of values we aren't ashamed or embarrassed of defending, but which form the backbone of our common life. And there's so much, as Rahm said, that our city leaders and policymakers can do to improve social integration. For example, we shouldn't be embarrassed to say that we expect people moving to our cities to learn about our way of life. I think people doing public-facing jobs in London should speak English. And clearly government and cities need to improve the support we provide for them to do so, because a common language is necessary for a common life. Our public institutions should improve our common values, laws and equalities, and proudly so. We should community-proof our housing and planning laws to ensure that the homes we build today can become integrated communities of tomorrow. We should build 21st century community institutions where neighbours want to come together and have real reasons to do so. We need to ensure that minority communities have a sense of belonging, so that they are resilient so they're as resilient as possible to extremism and radicalisation. We should create the right conditions for new migrants to fully integrate into their new neighbourhoods, providing clear advice on our values and expectations. And we should use our public services to build bonds of trust between people with different life experiences. In short, we should be building bridges rather than walls. The need to improve social integration has been made all the more urgent by events on both sides of the Atlantic. Over recent years, we've seen a series of horrendous and criminal terrorist attacks in New York, Boston, Orlando, London, Paris, Nice, Istanbul, and across the world. In the UK, the vote to leave the European Union, Brexit, was largely driven by growing anti-immigration sentiment. Now, I'm proud that London was the only region in England to vote to remain in the European Union, but concerns about immigration was the number one issue for voters across Britain. In France, the same worries and concerns have led to the burkini ban this summer, where there is a ridiculous situation of politicians and courts telling women what they can and can't wear on the beach. Here in the USA, you're heading towards a presidential election which will be dominated by these issues like no other. And it all leads back to social integration. Now, it's not for me to get involved in a presidential election in another country. As much as I love the USA, it's up to Americans to decide who runs your country. But I will say this. We play straight into the hands of those who seek to divide us, of extremists and terrorists around the world, when we imply that it's not possible to hold Western values dear and to be a Muslim. It only makes it harder to build integrated and cohesive communities, and it makes it easier for terrorists to radicalize our young people, making us less safe, whether in the USA, France, or Britain, because it's dividing rather than uniting, and because it builds walls to keep us apart rather than bridges to bring us together. The reality is, globalization means our world is getting smaller. Cities are becoming more and more diverse, and we have so much to learn from each other. But diversity is not the same as integration. My ambition is to make London the most cohesive city in the world, the most interconnected city in the world, and the most socially integrated city in the world, to protect our tolerance and our diversity for generations to come. I've recently appointed London's first ever Deputy Mayor of Social Integration, Matthew Ryder, and I'm delighted that he's here this evening. Matthew's been tasked with finding the best practice from around the world to bring back to London, to test and put it into action, working with charities, employers and government bodies to strengthen our communities. Because we need to have a real conversation domestically and internationally about social integration. And can I just end by saying this? Our thinking on social integration is very much still developing. This is a new an exciting area of public policy. A 21st century challenge resulting from globalization and cultural change. Fresh challenges which require fresh and innovative solutions. And I'm looking forward to working with mayors around the world, from Rahm, right here in Chicago, to Bill de Blasio in New York, from Denis Coderre in Montreal to Anne Hidalgo in Paris, and many others. For the first time ever, social integration and community cohesion are at the very top of the agenda of all Western cities. Together, we can compare levels of social integration between cities like London, Chicago, New York, and Paris. Together, we can determine what makes our communities flourish and what makes them thrive. Together, we can build bridges rather than walls. Thank you.
Mayor, thank you so much for a really insightful and important set of statements. As I noted earlier, if you want to ask a question, you do that online. I have many of them here in front of me, but let me start with a question at the core of your argument, the importance of social integration. What's the biggest challenge that you think that exists to social integration? And take perhaps London as an example.
You know, it's a cliche, and the thing with cliches, most of them are cliches because they're true. But we have far more in common than that divides us. And the big challenge for social integration is remembering that. Because it's very easy, especially for those of us with progressive values, to feel uncomfortable artificially persuading people to mix. Because we think there are so many differences, but we've got so much in common. And it's really important that when it comes particularly to cities becoming more and more diverse, we don't hide away from the fact that actually there is so much that unites us. Look, people who come to Chicago or London or New York or Paris from other parts of the world don't come to sit on their backside and not to mix. There's a reason why they've made huge sacrifices to come. And we've got to recognize that in an interdependent world, we've really got to be speaking to each other much more, making sure we live side by side. As I said, working together, playing together, studying together. And I've got to tell you this, it's not just a metaphor or a play on words said by somebody else. That means building bridges, not walls.
Let me go to the first question, which from the Chicago audience is what you would expect, which is what lessons can Chicago learn from London in regards to fighting crime when London does not face the relaxed firearm laws that we have? Are there any lessons that we in the city in Chicago can take from London? Look,
you've got to be very, very careful, especially when you're, not on top of facts in another country, to lecture another country or another city how to do things. Because the easy thing to say is that we do it this way, you should copy our ways. And the history and culture of firearms in America is very different from our culture. The basic concept we have in relation to crime is that the British police, for the last 300 years, has had a model of policing by consent. In London, for example, there are 32,000 police officers. Our population is 8.6 million. There is no way 32,000 officers can keep London safe by themselves. They require the confidence and the trust of the British public, Londoners, to come forward to report crime, to be witnesses in prosecutions, to join the police service, and to do the things we need to do to keep our city safe. And that's the biggest challenge we face as a city. How do you police by consent? And it's difficult, and it's a challenge. And police officers do such a hard job. When the rest of us are in danger, who do we ring? We ring the police. We run away from danger, they run to danger. And so it's difficult to get that balance right. So I don't want to come here and lecture Chicago how to be fantastic like London is. And we are. But it's recognised, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm a firm believer in policing by consent. And we've got challenges. Let's say in London, let me give you an example of the challenge. In London, of the 32,000 police officers, on Friday I went to a passing out parade where new officers joined. Only on Friday did we exceed 4,000 black, Asian, minority ethnic officers. Only 16% of our police service is what we call black, Asian, minority ethnic. Only on Friday did we exceed 8,000 of our officers being women. Only 26% are women. How can you police by consent when the police service doesn't look like the city that she seeks to police. So there are challenges for us as well, and we need to grapple with them.
You mentioned Brexit, and for those of us who are observers of what goes on in the United Kingdom, this was an important topic here and continues to be an important topic. How do you think that Brexit will impact the crisis with regard to refugees, which is affecting Europe and the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to recognise that actually, look, the first thing I want to say is this. London voted decisively to remain in the European Union. In some authorities, some boroughs, 80% voted to remain. Unfortunately, the rest of the country voted to leave the European Union. And I'm a firm believer in you've got rules of the game, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And you know, my side lost the referendum, and so the countries decided to leave the EU. That being said, London has been for 1,000 years a city open to people, to trade, and to ideas. That's not going to change. London is open. And one of the reasons why I'm here and why I accepted Rahm's very kind invitation to come here is to see what we can do in collaboration. We're not going to stop being open-minded and outward-looking. But actually, on some of the global challenges we face, we can't do it alone. Whether it's climate change, whether it's addressing the refugee crisis there is. And I was in Montreal this morning with Prime Minister Trudeau, and there's lots of work taking place internationally in relation to taking on asylum seekers and refugees, providing a haven. My own country is not doing enough. I've been critical of my government for not taking on enough refugees and asylum seekers. And I'm quite old-fashioned about this. I think we are a brother's keeper. We're not going to walk on the other side. A society should be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable. And I'm afraid there are some countries who aren't doing enough and need to do much more. Some of these challenges, though, you can't do by yourself. You need to do as a team. And the European Union needs to step up much more than we currently have.
Sticking just with refugees for a minute, are there best practices on refugee social integration that you look to in London that we should all look to? It's a key part of the social integration fabric that particularly in Europe we're facing, but in other parts of the world as well.
It's really important we remind ourselves that immigration takes many forms. Immigration can be because somebody falls in love with somebody overseas and there's an issue with immigration. Immigration can be because students who come here to study decide to stay in the country where they study. Immigration can be because of family reunion. Immigration can be for people who apply for work permits and stay there for economic reasons. But immigration can also be because of refugees and asylum seekers. And now the reality is you take on those who are fleeing persecution, who are in fear of their life. And so the reality is a civilized society takes people on. Once they're in the country and they've gone through the due process and they are somebody who is a refugee as defined by the UN Convention, the reality is you can't just leave them alone. They need support, whether it's housing, whether it's welfare, whether it's medical, whether it's schooling for their children. I make this point as somebody who was born and raised in London, but who is the child of first-generation immigrants. Look, how are you going to speak to your neighbours? How are you going to speak to teachers at your children's school? How are you going to apply for a job if you can't speak the language? And we shouldn't be embarrassed about saying, look, this is a helping hand providing courses to learn English, because you can then be a better citizen. And it's really important we integrate properly new arrivals into our country. But I say this as well. Don't assume just because somebody was born and raised in your city, your country, they're integrated. They have a sense of belonging. There are many people in London who are 12th generation Londoners who don't feel they belong. There are many communities who feel left behind. And the challenge we have, and it's a challenge that Rahm is grappling with, Bill de Blasio is grappling with, Dennis Corder is grappling with, Anne Hidalgo is grappling with, is how we ensure, as the rich get richer, the poor don't get poorer. And that is a real challenge we've got in, as progressives, to make sure the fruits of prosperity are shared by everyone. And that sense of belonging is important. Look, what you want is a young person who is approached by a preacher of hate, could be a gang leader, and say, look, the way to get rich quick, or the way to be successful in this world and the hereafter is doing ABC. The young person says, you're talking rubbish. I know the way to succeed is by working hard. Another way to succeed is by making sure I listen to my teachers or the parents. It's not true that the West hates us, because I've got friends who are the West. I am the West. It's not true that there's a conspiracy that Jews and Muslims can't be friends. My best friend's a Jew. And it's really important we teach our young people that resilience, and that's integration, not simply for new arrivals or refugees. That's integration for those who are 12th, 13th, 14th generation Londoners or from Chicago.
Sticking on the social integration and the challenges that we face with regard to the internet. Is the internet a source of division or a source of cohesion? How can we use the internet and social media as a means to social integration as opposed to further dividing us?
Look, the internet is amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, the ability to do good via the internet is amazing. The advances in technology over the last 10 years exceed the advances of the last 100 years before that. But like every great thing, there are challenges. So it is a fact that in London, there are Londoners, and they are Londoners, born and raised in London, who are radicalized in their bedroom through the internet, to the extent their family doesn't know, to the extent they jump on a plane and go to Syria or Iraq to what they think is performed jihad. We've had 3 London girls, school-aged children, who jumped on a plane and went to get married to, inverted comma, jihadis as a result of the internet. And that means, look, even those of us who are passionate about civil liberties and human rights, recognizing that there are some websites got to be shut down. We've got to recognize that we've got to think about how we police this marvelous thing called the internet. We've also got to recognize that, look, just like there are people propagating hatred, we've got to think about, in a clever way, counter messages as well. It's really important we recognize that, look, these nihilistic messages are out there, and the internet can be used to challenge those things, and we shouldn't be afraid to do so.
Another area of social integration to think about. In Singapore...
You're not going to mention the Cubs, are you?
No, we don't. You know what happened when you started talking about the Mets, so we will stick to the Cubs. Now I'm talking about Singapore. In Singapore, we have, in order to have social integration, there's quotas and forced integration among housing. Is that a way to do it, or is this something that needs to be more organic at a community level? Are there policies that can really promote that social integration that you can do from above, or does it have to come from below? What's the relationship?
The lesson I learned a long time ago is when there's a hard job to do, ask somebody else to do it. And that's why Matthew's my deputy mayor for social integration. So one of the things Matthew's going to be doing is either studying what other cities do and city-states do, just to see what works. This is a really exciting, developing area of work here. I'm by instinct not a muscular, aggressive person when it comes to these sorts of things. I think, you want to persuade people why it's in your interest and our interest to mix, rather than forcing somebody to mix. But there's basic things you can do. I'll give you an example. When it comes to deciding what's built, planning, let's think about, are there community spaces for people to mix? Because we've got developments being built in London where nobody's thought about community space. So how are you going to get to know your neighbour? I mean, the traditional way for someone like me is you've either got kids and you meet people in the playground, or you've got a pet and you talk to people while you're walking your dog, right? But if you haven't got a dog or children, and so think about, are there places for people to socialise? Traditionally, it used to be pubs, but if people don't drink, is pubs the mode. So planning's got a role to play, which is not directly forcing people, but it's thinking about it. You could look at the admissions policy of schools. If it's the case that the admissions policy is what we call a catchment area from a certain geography, and in that geography the housing project is a monoethnic, then don't be surprised if that school is monoethnic as well. Who are those children mixing with? If it's the case there's a monoethnic school, can we encourage mixing by having sports together, having joint lessons? And so one of the jobs Matthew's got is to look at what works well. Singapore good example of integration in some instances, but we've got to see what works and suck it and see.
So, looking around the world and learning from that, talk about two countries, one of which you mentioned, another one is facing a real issue, France and Germany. How do you see the integrationist policies working in France or not? And what advice would you have to a Germany that in 1 year, less than 1 year, got 1 million refugees into their country and needed to be part of it?
You know what's the great thing about coming to the Council on Global Affairs is not only am I asked to comment on police in Chicago and on what I want to pitch from Singapore, I'm also asked to comment on France and Germany, and I love that. It's great. And nobody's mentioned Donald Trump yet, which is very good.
We'll get to that.
So look, I mean, Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, is a good friend of Rahm and mine. She's brilliant. She really is brilliant. France has major problems, major challenges. Look, let me just remind ourselves, and I say this as the father of two daughters, who's a passionate and proud feminist. For decades now, women and men have been campaigning, rightfully so, for women to be in control of their own body, for women to be able to do whatever course at university they want to do, for women to be able to do any job they want to do. And yet we're telling women what they can and can't wear on the beach. And that can't be right. And so, I've not been told yet what the security risk is with a woman wearing a bikini, right, on a beach. And so maybe somebody can explain the security risk. But I think we've got to recognize that actually, the politics of fear can lead to bad decisions being taken. And I think, that's why integration is so important, Ivo. It affects Berlin and Paris and Madrid and Chicago and London because, France has suffered some horrible terrorist attacks in Paris, in Nice, in Normandy, and they are tragic. And so my anxiety and nervousness is that we'll grapple with this problem, and it is an issue that needs addressing in a knee-jerk way, leading to, I'm afraid, consequences that aren't great, rather than in a constructive way. One of the reasons why I'm here working with Rahm, Bill de Blasio, Dennis Coderre, Anne Hidalgo, is we need us to seize the agenda and to recognize those of us on the left can't be laissez-faire now. We've got to be talking about this. And actually, I want young French citizens of Islamic faith to be incredibly proud to be French and to be a Muslim. I want young Germans of Islamic faith to be incredibly proud that they work with Jewish people and Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists and Christians and those not a member of an organized faith. Look, for me, I'm the first mayor in our city's history, the first mayor to not simply walk in the Pride Parade, to lead it and to address the LGBT plus community in London. I'm the guy who, when he voted for same-sex marriage, had, a cleric put out a fatwa against me. And the reality is, in all religions, you're going to get a minority who will be unhelpful. But, what we've got is an opportunity to, lay the foundations for social integration that will, mean my children and their children will reap the fruits of the work we're doing now.
Well, I think you did quite well on the French and the German part. So let me go back.
There aren't any French or German.
Let me get back to London and the UK and Brexit in particular. If Brexit, and I'll make it as an if, not when, but if Brexit leads to an economic slowdown in the UK, how might this affect community relations in London?
Well, it's really important that we do the best that we can to make Brexit work for London and for our country. History tells us that when there are economic downturns, it leads to problems in community relations. It's just a fact. Riots don't occur when there's boom times. Riots occur when there's economic downturns and when there are issues. One of the things that we've got to make sure we do is make sure that people have a sense of belonging, make sure people have a stake, make sure people recognize that politicians are trying to address some of the challenges they face. I'm confident, actually, Ivo, that actually, if you look at the last couple of months, things are pretty good in London, pretty good for our country. The challenge we've got is to persuade, speaking as the London Mayor, the government, when it comes to negotiating with the EU, to do right by London and our country. That means, for example, access to a single market is crucial. That means, for example, the passporting of financial services. That means, for example, telling the world that London is open like we've been for more than 1,000 years. And that's why it's imperative for politicians, leaders and others to work together to make sure communities are resilient. So if things do go, economically worse, or there's an economic downturn, we're resilient to deal with it.
You've got a huge stake in this. How does a mayor of London get his voice, in your case, his voice, heard in this negotiation? What is the relationship between the national government, which is negotiating about the future of the country, including your city, and how do you get that voice into the affairs of that negotiation?
Well, the good news is, and the Conservative government deserve credit, is they understand that London is the powerhouse for our country. They understand that there's a huge amount of FDI in London from around the world. One of the reasons is because we've got a brilliant mayor. The other reason, there's another reason as well, is we've access to a single market, and the government, we're trying to lobby them, and they look like they will accede to this. Is that we need to have a seat around the negotiating table. So the government understands when it comes to negotiating with the EU what our needs are, what our aspirations are, what the challenges are. So, for example, 4 of the best universities, the top universities in the world, 4 out of the top 35 are in London. We have more international students in London than any other city in the world. We have more universities, top universities, out of the top 35 any other city in the world. Leaving the EU could present challenges for us. We need to make sure we understand that. Look at the financial centre in London. London is a leading global commercial centre. I'd argue it's the financial capital of the world. I'd also argue London is the cultural capital of the world. I'd also argue, by the way, we're the political capital of the world. And so, my point to the government, and they're listening, is that, they've got to make sure that they take on board our concerns when it comes to negotiating with the EU partners.
Talk a little bit about housing. Big issue in the elections, continues to be a big issue. You have gentrification as part of the natural development. You have the problems of housing prices going up. What is the best way to tackle that housing crisis? Do you agree with Prime Minister May that rented accommodations to tackle the housing crisis might be one way to go about it? How do you see that? Well,
firstly, let me just explain to you the scale of how bad the housing problem in London is. We have a situation now where we've got adults who are graduates with good jobs who have come back home and live with mum and dad. Unless you have what I call bank of mum and dad to help you with a deposit, you can't afford to buy a property. Most young people are renting in London, paying huge rents with no security of tenure. And so we need to build genuinely affordable homes in London to buy and rent. London should no longer be the world's money laundering capital. There are too many, they're not really homes, they're units of housing built in London with laundered money left empty. We've got to address that. One of the things that Rahm is showing me is the regeneration around the riverside, the lakeside. We need to think about making sure we build homes in London that are not only affordable, but are vibrant communities, and that includes, culture and, retail and stuff. So I've come to see what works elsewhere as well. The key thing for me is making sure that a young Londoner today has the chances I had. From a housing project, my mum and dad were able to buy their own property. I lived at home with my mum and dad till I was 24 on the top bed of a bunk bed, saving for a deposit. My wife and I were able to buy our own property with the help of a mortgage, aged 25. The research tells us, unless we take drastic action, by 2030, 1 out of 3 adult children will still be living with mum and dad. Now, I love my daughters, but they got to leave at some stage.
Finally, I'm going to have 2 political questions to end this up. One is the future of the Labour Party. How does it get back into a majority in Parliament?
I think time's out now, isn't it? So
I could ask you about the American elections, but
that's easier. Look, listen. We as a party are going through a difficult time. we've lost not one but two general elections in a row. Let me tell you the scale of the challenge we've got. In 2010, only 29% of the British public who voted for Labour. That's the second worst result in history. In 2015, 30% voted Labour. And every day we are out of power, people have been let down because the current government and the last government aren't doing for all of Brits what needs to happen, whether it's housing, health service, schooling. And, we're going through difficult times. And, one of the reasons why I was keen to go to Montreal and speak to Justin Trudeau is to learn some of the lessons from his success. The Liberal Party was in third place when Trudeau became the leader. And I appreciate we aren't going to get a rock star becoming the leader of the Labour Party in the near future. But, there are lessons we can learn because the reality is this: progressive parties around the world are going through difficult periods. You look at France, you look at Germany. Some would say look at the United States of America in relation to the presidential elections. But, we've got to make sure that we, as soon as possible, get back into a state where we're an effective opposition and we're ready to form the next government. And it's crucial, not for the Labour Party, it's crucial for our country.
You talked about the White Sox, talked about the Cubs, so here's the really tough question. Arsenal, Chelsea, Crystal Palace, Spurs?
So like all good South Londoners, I support Liverpool. And the thing is, look, Rahm, you know this, you support a team when you're little and you don't expect to be the mayor of a city. And so you can't change the team you support to win votes. But here's the bigger problem. There are 10 soccer teams in London. So if I did support a London team, I'm upsetting the others lot as well. But I'm a Liverpool fan, long suffering, owned by Americans, by the way.
A great politician. Maybe that rock star of the Labour Party needs one day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.